Welcome back, everybody. Today's class will be slightly shorter time-wise. This is simply because there is less material on this particular section than in the others. So we'll have a shorter class today, and we'll run straight through instead of having a break in the middle. Right, so what happened last week? Let's just quickly remind ourselves. God keeps the covenant he made to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob by delivering their descendants, called the children of Israel, from slavery in Egypt. In order for God's promise of giving them land, to be a great nation, to have kings, and so on, they have to be free. So he brings them out single-handedly from Egypt by miracles, across the Red Sea and into the Sinai Desert to a mountain called Mount Sinai. And as we explored last time, the plan was to continue across the desert and into the land called Canaan. This is the same land God promised Abraham years earlier. What happens in the following years in the desert is a fascinating story. But because we're trying to just get an overview of the grand narrative in this class, we are going to skip past the details to just get the bigger picture. After the people are given the covenant at Sinai, they travel to the borders of Canaan. And as we read previously in Exodus 23 and 31, God says, I am literally sending a messenger ahead of you to do battle for you. This angel will go ahead and fight for you as you enter this foreign land. But as we saw, the people are afraid, saying the country is filled with giants, and we will be crushed by those living there. The people conclude, we want to go back to Egypt. And so because they don't want to enter and they don't believe God will conquer the land for them, they travel round the desert again, stuck between the past and the future for 40 years. God had to patiently wait until the generation who refused to enter died and a new generation was born. And most of the story of them just being in the desert is found in the book of Numbers. Now, during those years, God struggles to just keep the people alive. Not because the desert is so harsh an environment, but because it is difficult to keep them from doing things that would kill them all. And by doing so, break the line of Abraham and stop God from keeping his promises. Simple things like trying to teach them basic hygiene, keeping them from having anarchy and complete chaos in the camp. Well, if you remember, Moses was getting really old towards the end, and he holds his last great speech to all the people. We said that this is the book of Deuteronomy, Moses' last speech. And in this speech, he summarizes everything that has happened to the people since Egypt. He reminds them of what God has done, how they had acted, what he has promised them. And early on in his speech, he says the following. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. You will love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your strength. These commandments that I give you today are to be on your hearts. Impress them on your children. Talk about them when you sit at home and when you walk along the road, when you lie down and when you get up. This right here is called the Shema. The Shema is a Hebrew word which means hear or listen, and it came to be known as the summary of the whole law. Thousands of years later, the Jews would still say the Shema first thing in the morning and before going to bed. And it is said that traditionally, these would be the last words a Jew said before he died. It is important to note here that this phrase, the Shema, was not intended to be taught as a rite of passage. A rite of passage is a ritual or an act which allows a person to access a certain group. Like you may have to do something to be a member of a club, such as lick a goat, or you may have to take an exam if you want to be a nurse. Well, the Shema was not meant to be a rite of passage, and this is proved by the following. First of all, that it is written in Hebrew in the form of a promise. You will love the Lord your God, and so on. Thus reflecting the same promise language which we looked at with the Ten Commandments. And secondly, in how the Jews were taught to summarize the law. As we said, they summed up the law with the Shema. And what does the text say? What is the focus of the Shema? To love God. It's a relational language. And this is a relational charge, not a cold command, not a dead rule on a page, but love God with all your heart. But then, of course, this seems like a problematic command to be given. Love God with all your heart. Definitely problematic. Because the people have already demonstrated again and again that they don't do anything wholeheartedly. The whole book of Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers shows us over and over again that the people of Israel are always pulled in different directions. They don't fully love anything. And if we have some self-insight, we might also today look at these words and go, I don't know how to do that. I don't know how to love God with all my heart. I don't do anything with all my heart. Now, this problem is something which we're going to come back to later in this story, but I've introduced it now so that we can keep it in the back of our minds as we move forward. So, that was a refresher on where we've arrived to today. We return to this scene where a new generation of Israelites emerges from the desert and is once more standing on the borders of the Promised Land. And after saying goodbye to Moses, they are about to enter into Canaan. This time, they do enter, led by Joshua, who has by now become the people's leader. And the story of how the land is conquered and what happens as they move through it is found in the book of Joshua. By the end of Joshua, the Israelites have conquered the land and the territory is divided up between the 12 tribes of Israel. So they each get their own territory. And similarly to Moses, Joshua also holds a last speech to the people before they all go each their way and get settled in their new home. Let's get the lay of the land with Joshua's speech. Among other things, he says the following. After a long time had passed, and the Lord had given Israel rest from all their enemies around them, Joshua, by then a very old man, summoned all Israel, their elders, leaders, judges, and officials. Verse 6, Be very strong, says Joshua. Be careful to keep all that is written in the book of the law of Moses, without turning aside to the right or to the left. Then you won't become like those nations remaining among you. Don't even mention the name of their gods, let alone have people swear by them, serve them, or worship them, but cling to the Lord your God. Verse 10, It is because the Lord your God has fought on your behalf, as he said he would. Now I am about to go the way of all the earth. You know with all your heart and soul that not one of all the good promises that the Lord your God gave you has failed. Every promise has been fulfilled. Not one has failed. And then to chapter 24, verses 14 to 15. Joshua says, "Now revere the Lord and serve him truly and sincerely. Throw away the gods your ancestors worshipped beyond the Euphrates River and in Egypt and serve the Lord." But if serving the Lord seems undesirable to you, then choose for yourselves this day whom you will serve, whether the gods your ancestors served beyond the Euphrates or the gods of the Amorites in whose land you are living. But as for me and my household, we will serve the Lord. So Joshua is again summing up the story so far to the people, and he ends with a charge. In short, make up your minds. When Joshua says, "Throw away the idols which your ancestors worshipped in Babylon and in Egypt," this suggests that there indeed are still idols among the people. Otherwise, he wouldn't talk about throwing them away. Joshua says, "Choose now which God you will serve." How will the people respond to this charge? Verse 16 to 18, "Then the people answered, 'Far be it from us to forsake the Lord to serve other gods. It was the Lord our God himself who brought us and our parents up out of Egypt from that land of slavery and performed those great signs before our eyes. He protected us on our entire journey and among all the nations through which we traveled. And the Lord drove out before us all the nations, including the Amorites, who lived in the land. We too will serve the Lord because he is our God.'" This sounds like a very nice and positive response. What does Joshua have to say about this reply? Verse 19, Joshua said to the people, "You are not able to serve the Lord." But the people said to Joshua, "No, we will serve the Lord." Then Joshua said, "You are witnesses against yourselves that you have chosen to serve the Lord." "Yes, we are witnesses," they replied. So the people are verbally making a decision, and so Joshua charges them again. "Now then," Joshua urged, "throw away the foreign gods that are among you, and turn your hearts to the Lord, the God of Israel." And the people said to Joshua, "We will serve the Lord our God and obey him." On that day, Joshua made a covenant for the people, and there at Shechem, he reaffirmed for them decrees and laws. So Joshua reiterates the covenant, reminding the people of its terms on that day. And if you noticed, their response to the covenant offer is echoing exactly what their parents had said in the desert. Everything the Lord has said, we will do. Joshua says, no, you can't. You clearly can't serve the Lord and be faithful to his covenant. And the people reply, yes, we can. We will do it. Joshua just concludes in the end, all right, you are witnesses against yourselves. Your words stand witness against you. Then they are all dismissed to go each their way into the land. Now, following this, during the next 300 years or so, the people live in the land promised to them. During these years, God appoints judges to rule over the people. Why? Because if you recall, the people didn't want to hear from God himself, from him directly. They said, put someone in between us. So the judges became these in-between people for a time, the ones who were communicators between God and the people. You can find the story of the judges and what happens during these years in the book of Judges, which follows after the book of Joshua. After Judges, we get to the book of 1 Samuel. Now, at this point, a man named Samuel is the current judge in Israel. But one day, the people come to him and demand a king. You see, they had looked at all the nations around them, and these nations were ruled by kings. So the Israelites wanted one too. Interestingly, by the way the people ask the question of Samuel, the people seem to assume that God didn't intend for them to have a king. But is that true? Well, let's remind ourselves. Genesis 17:16, God is talking here to Abraham. I will bless her, that is Sarah, and will surely give you a son by her. I will bless her so that she will be the mother of nations. Kings of peoples will come from her. And later on in Deuteronomy 17:14-20, when you enter the land the Lord your God is giving you, and have taken possession of it and settled in it, and you say, let us set a king over us like the nations around us, be sure to appoint over you a king that the Lord your God chooses. He must be from among your fellow Israelites. Do not place a foreigner over you, one who is not an Israelite. The king, moreover, must not acquire great numbers of horses for himself, or make the people return to Egypt to get more of them. For the Lord has told you, you are not to go back that way again. He must not take many wives, or his heart will be led astray. He must not accumulate large amounts of silver and gold. When he takes the throne of his kingdom, he is to write for himself on a scroll a copy of this law, taken from that of the Levitical priests. It is to be with him, and he is to read it all the days of his life, so that he may learn to revere the Lord his God and follow carefully all the words of this law and these decrees, and not consider himself better than his fellow Israelites, and turn from the law to the right or to the left. Then he and his descendants will reign a long time over his kingdom in Israel. So, to unpack this a bit, in Genesis 17, God states that it is his plan and promise to raise up kings in Abraham's descendants. And later on, God said in Moses' time that one day the people will ask for a king. And this is how they are to choose that king and how he should act. So clearly, kingship wasn't against the plan of God. Rather, kings were part of his plan. But the way a king was made and when mattered. God said in Deuteronomy 17, a king isn't meant to be made or chosen by the people, but just like the judges, they were to be appointed by God. Let's read the scene surrounding the asking for a king in 1 Samuel chapter 8. When Samuel grew old, he appointed his sons as Israel's leaders. The name of his firstborn was Joel, and the name of his second was Abijah, and they served at Beersheba. But his sons did not follow his ways. They turned aside after dishonest gain and accepted bribes and perverted justice. So all the elders of Israel gathered together and came to Samuel at Ramah. They said to him, "You are old, and your sons do not follow your ways. Now appoint a king to lead us, such as all the other nations have." But when they said, "Give us a king to lead us," this displeased Samuel. So he prayed to the Lord, and the Lord told him, "Listen to all that the people are saying to you. It is not you they have rejected, but they have rejected me as their king, as they have done from the day I brought them up out of Egypt until this day, forsaking me and serving other gods, so they are doing to you. Now listen to them, but warn them solemnly and let them know what the king who will reign over them will claim as his rights." Samuel told all the words of the Lord to the people who were asking him for a king. He said, "This is what the king who will reign over you will claim as his rights. He will take your sons and make them serve with his chariots and horses, and they will run in front of his chariots. Some he will assign to be commanders of thousands and commanders of fifties, and others will plow his ground and reap his harvest, and still others will make weapons of war and equipment for his chariots. He will take your daughters to be perfumers and cooks and bakers. He will take the best of your fields and vineyards and olive groves and give them to his attendants. He will take 1/10 of your grain and of your vintage and give it to his officials and attendants. Your male and female servants and the best of your cattle and donkeys he will take for his own use. He will take 1/10 of your flocks, and you yourselves will become his slaves. When that day comes, you will cry out for relief from the king you have chosen, but the Lord will not answer you in that day." But the people refused to listen to Samuel. "No," they said, "we want a king over us. Then we will be like the other nations, with a king to lead us and to go out before us and fight our battles." When Samuel heard all that the people said, he repeated it before the Lord. The Lord answered, "Listen to them and give them a king." Then Samuel said to the Israelites, "Everyone, go back to your own town." So, this is the buildup leading to the people asking for a king. Samuel had, as an imperfect person, failed at some of the things in his judge duties. And the way he had failed was, number one, Samuel made his sons judges. This was never supposed to happen. Judges were meant to be appointed by God, not inherit the title. And number two, his sons did not do what was right. They became corrupt leaders. And so the people react against this and say, "We want a king instead." In summary, Samuel does something wrong, arguably spurring the people to also do something wrong in turn. Well, the first king the Israelites chose was a man named Saul. His reign begins fairly well, and he seems a natural leader, but it all unravels along the way and ends in disaster. Saul was suitable to be king in the eyes of the people, but now it's God's turn. And he chooses the next king. He chooses David. And it is here that we arrive at the next chapter in our covenant study, the Davidic Covenant. So God chooses a person called David to be king, and David eventually takes the throne. The story of the reign of David is found in the next book along, in 2 Samuel. After many years, David is finally crowned king. Let's read what happens after he takes the throne. 2 Samuel chapter 7, verse 1 to 3. After the king, that is David, was settled in his palace, and the Lord had given him rest from all his enemies around him, he said to Nathan the prophet, "Here I am, living in a house of cedar, while the ark of God remains in a tent." Nathan replied to the king, "Whatever you have in mind, go ahead and do it, for the Lord is with you." To explain this, David has been on the run for years, hunted by the last king, his enemies, and even at times his own people. Now he's finally in the royal palace in Jerusalem, sitting comfortably. And he thinks, man, here I am in a palace while God is living in a tent. For if you remember, God came to live with Israel in a tent called the tabernacle or the tent of meeting, where God sat on his throne, which was the Ark of the Covenant. And David thinks, I'm here surrounded by gold and soft pillows, and God is living in an old tent from the desert. I want to make life better for God. David shares his idea with the prophet Nathan. This is what I want to do to make not a movable, dusty old tent for God to live in, but a fixed home. How does David's idea sound to us as readers today? Well, if someone said to you, hey, I want to build you a beautiful house to live in, sounds pretty good, doesn't it? Even Nathan replies, yes, go for it. But God had said, back in the days of Moses, I want a dwelling place which moves with the people, accessible on the same level ground as them. God was saying, I want to move with you. And here David is actually saying, no, God, you should be in a fixed place. Is David's suggestion, despite his good intentions, a way to box in God? Well, God seems to have something to say about it. Let's read 2 Samuel 7:4-7. But that night the word of the Lord came to Nathan, saying, Go and tell my servant David, this is what the Lord says. Are you the one to build me a house to dwell in? I have not dwelt in a house from the day I brought the Israelites up out of Egypt to this day. I have been moving from place to place with a tent as my dwelling, wherever I have moved with all the Israelites. Did I ever say to any of their rulers, who I commanded to shepherd my people Israel, why have you not built me a house of cedar? Earlier, when in the presence of the king, Nathan had basically spoken for God, saying, yes, the Lord is with you, go ahead. But God comes and has a chat with Nathan that night, basically saying, did I ask for that? Did I tell you to say that? And then God goes on to say, have I ever asked for a house of cedar to be built for me? Also, you want to build a house for me. Could any house, any building, no matter how grand or covered in gold and diamonds, no matter how large or luxurious, could it ever be worthy of the God of the universe? Anything God chooses to be inside of is beneath him, so to speak. It is a humbling, because he is above everything and maker of everything. David was thinking along the terms that this beautiful cedar house he had in mind for God would be more worthy of him. But anything God would live in would be an act of humility. Whether it's a tent or a mansion or a castle, none of it is so-called good enough for him. And so God here says, you want to build a house for me. That night, God reminds Nathan who is leading who, implying, please don't tell me what to do. But also, an important thing to note here, although Nathan made a mistake, God doesn't thunder and boom at him in anger. Nathan doesn't seem scared or overwhelmed by this interaction or correction. Instead, God corrects him calmly and then says, please go and correct this mistake to David too. Now then, tell my servant David, this is what the Lord Almighty says. I took you from the pasture, from tending the flock, and appointed you ruler over my people Israel. I have been with you wherever you have gone, and I have cut off all your enemies from before you. Now I will make your name great, like the names of the greatest men on earth. So how does God respond to David's idea? Well, he says, I am going to do these things. I promise you these things. Does that sound like anything we've heard before? Well, yes. It sounds like a covenant God makes with people. It's covenant language. God says, I have brought you this far, and this is what I promise you in the future. He says to David, you were following sheep, but I made you a ruler. Now, the ranking in a household at the time would have been family, then sheep, then follower of the sheep. It's the family on top, the flocks and herds belonging to that family, and then whomever's hired as a servant shepherd to drive and watch the flock. So in his society and in his family dynamic, David was at the bottom of that hierarchy. And God turned it on its head, saying to David, you are king. I have been wherever you went. I cut off your enemies. I will make your name great. But he doesn't stop there. God continues, when your days are over and you rest with your ancestors, I will raise up your offspring to succeed you, your own flesh and blood, and I will establish his kingdom. He is the one who will build a house for my name, and I will establish the throne of his kingdom forever. I will be his father, and he will be my son. When he does wrong, I will punish him with a rod wielded by men, with floggings inflicted by human hands. But my grace will never leave him, as I took it away from Saul, whom I removed from before you. Your house and your kingdom will endure forever before me. Your throne will be established forever. Nathan reported to David all the words of this entire revelation. So, what happens here? God proceeds then to make more promises. David said, I want to build a house for God. And God replies, I will make you a house. And there seems to be something else. God promises he will raise up a king among David's descendants who will have an everlasting kingdom, meaning one which won't end. Now that right there sounds rather strange because all men die and all kings die. God also, as he said to the Israelites in the desert, says, do not destroy yourselves before I can even keep my promises to you, and through you bless the whole world. Because part of God's covenant with Abraham, if you recall, is to bless the whole world through him and his descendants. That's what God is saying here in verse 14. If you start doing things that are self-destructive, that mean you won't even survive until the day I can help you in a more permanent way, then I'm going to have to use the people around you. That's what this phrase, floggings inflicted by human hands, means. I'm going to use the people, human hands around you to stop you. It appears by the sounds of it that God has set David on the throne for a reason. It is not to fix the world. Having David as king in Israel won't fix a broken world. But it's for a permanent king to come, one of David's descendants, who will have, according to the promise, a kingdom which will never end. And as we may recognize by now, all this God is saying to David is a covenant proposal. It is God initiated. God is making promises, saying, I will do these things, even if they seem to be impossible, and the gifts are undeserved. And so God here is offering a personal covenant with David. Do you remember how in Abraham's lifetime, God would sometimes add promises or add elaborating detail to his covenant promises with him? Well, he has just done something similar here. He just added something to his covenant with David. And just to break this down, as we said, a king in Israel was meant to be chosen and appointed by God. How would this choosing and appointing take place? Well, God's choosing of a king was expressed through an act called anointing. An anointing was a symbolic act which involved the pouring or smearing of oil on the chosen person's head. God would instruct a prophet or a judge to appoint a person he had chosen for a particular task. This act of pouring oil is an act illustrating God's choosing. You can see reference of this in several places in the Bible, for example, Psalms 89, verse 20. I have found David my servant. With my sacred oil I have anointed him. And David was anointed by the judge Samuel when God chose him to be king in 1 Samuel 16. Now, the Hebrew term for anoint is masah, and the act of anointing is masach. The Hebrew word for the anointed one or the chosen one is Mashiach. The anointed one is Ha-Mashiach. And this is where we get the word Messiah in English. Mashiach means Messiah. Messiah simply means the anointed one, the chosen one, or in this case, the chosen king of God. And God, here in this narrative, has said, David, down the line, in your seed, I will choose a Mashiach, a Messiah, an anointed one, a king whom I have chosen to sit on the throne, not for many years, but forever. This right here is what is called a messianic promise, a promise about a permanently anointed one to come, which simply means it's a covenant promise God is making, promising a Mashiach, an anointed king that is coming, whom God has chosen to put on the throne. And after making this messianic promise and adding it to the covenant with David, God also says, until these things happen, I have to keep your bloodline alive. If the line of David and the line of kings from you is broken, then how can I keep my promises to you to help you in a permanent way through this everlasting reign of a king? That's why, again, if you start to destroy yourselves, I must stop you. This simply means that God's measures to stop the people in any self-destruction is actually redemptive. Again, God is revealing bit by bit his plan of how he intends to rescue the world. He is peeling back the page piece by piece. In Genesis 3:15, God made this promise to Adam and Eve, one of your children will come, and though the serpent injures him, he will crush its head. In Genesis 17:16, God adds more detail to Abraham. I will make you very fruitful, I will make nations of you, and kings will come from you. So, as we can see over time, there is a narrowing happening. A more and more detailed and specific image of how God is going to keep his covenant promises is emerging and coming into focus. In Genesis, my promise will be kept through the seed of the woman, so through a human being. To Abraham, the promise will be kept through your children, so one of the children of Israel. And now to David. David, it's from your tribe, the tribe of Judah, and from your house specifically, from your family, that I will keep my promise. It's also interesting here that God is keeping his promises through the Israelite tribe of Judah, because Judah, among his 12 brothers, wasn't the eldest son. You might think that traditionally, if any inheriting or leadership is happening, it'll be through the eldest son. But God doesn't seem to care about that detail any more than he cared that Saul seemed a natural leader, or that David was the youngest and considered least of his brothers. So, all this began with David wanting to do something for God. And God says, I'm the one who is going to be doing something for you. And also, here, let me make you more promises. Now, what was David's response to all this? We've spent a lot of time in this course so far looking at responses to God's promises. Responses in the Sinai desert, responses of the Israelites. What now will David's response be? From verse 18. Then King David went in and sat before the Lord, and he said, Who am I, sovereign Lord, and what is my family that you have brought me this far? And as if this were not enough in your sight, sovereign Lord, you have also spoken about the future of the house of your servant. And this decree, sovereign Lord, is for a mere human. What more can David say to you? For you know your servant, sovereign Lord. For the sake of your word and according to your will, you have done this great thing and made it known to your servant. How great you are, sovereign Lord. There is no one like you, and there is no God but you, as we have heard with our own ears. And who is like your people Israel, the one nation on earth that God went out to redeem as a people for himself, and to make a name for himself, and to perform great and awesome wonders, by driving out other nations and their gods from before your people, whom you have redeemed from Egypt? You have established your people Israel as your very own forever, and you, Lord, have become their God. And now, Lord God, keep forever the promise you have made concerning your servant and his house. Do as you have promised, so that your name will be great forever. Then people will say, The Lord Almighty is God over Israel, and the house of your servant David will be established in your sight. Lord Almighty, God of Israel, you have revealed this to your servant, saying, I will make a house for you. So your servant has found courage to pray this prayer to you. Sovereign Lord, you are God. Your covenant is trustworthy, and you have promised these good things to your servant. Now be pleased to bless the house of your servant, that it may continue forever in your sight. For you, sovereign Lord, have spoken, and with your blessing the house of your servant will be blessed forever. What happens here? David leaves his palace, he walks down to where the tent of meeting is kept, and goes there to the tabernacle to speak with God. He sits down before God and says, Who am I and who are we as a people that you should give all these wonderful gifts? I've heard what you promised, Lord, and what you said about my future. What more can I say? Verse 20, David is so moved that he's speaking about himself in third person. And David just replies to God, I believe. Let it happen as you said. So this whole story began with David saying, I will do this for God, but it ends up not being about the house. It ended up being a renewed experience of what it's like to be in a covenant relationship with God. It ended up being about believing God will do what he says he'll do. Solomon, one of David's sons, does end up building a temple for God, which God will come to live in. But here, David's focus is shifted from what he can do for God to simply being grateful for what God will do for him and has done for him and what he's promising for the future. Thank you, and I believe you, is how we can sum up David's response. Now, as we said, you've probably noticed that human responses and responding to God's covenant promises is a recurring theme. It has popped up again and again in our class. Specifically, let's remind ourselves, what was Israel's response when God made a covenant with them in the Sinai desert? How did they reply when he made promises? Again and again, their response was, all you have said, we will do. But here, David's response is, all you've said, you will do. I believe you'll do it. Earlier, we said that we'd return to the topic of hearts. We read the Shema, the charge to Israel. If you remember, we asked, how can anyone love God with their whole heart? How can we possibly keep this charge to love God wholeheartedly? Well, let's again explore that question. As we've said, there seems to be two kinds of heart responses to God's covenant proposal. One, those who say, we will do it. Two, those who say, God will do it. I trust he will do it. Now, God said about the Israelites, their hearts are far from me, when they said, all you said we will do. But what does God have to say about David's heart? In 1 Samuel 13 to 14, the judge Samuel is talking to King Saul, and he says, you have done a foolish thing, Samuel said. You have not kept the command the Lord your God gave you. If you had, he would have established your kingdom over Israel for all time. But now your kingdom will not endure. The Lord has sought out a man after his own heart and appointed him ruler of his people, because you have not kept the Lord's command. Samuel is saying to the then King Saul, God is removing you from the throne and placing on it a man who we later learn as David. And this man is described as being after God's own heart. And in Acts 13, verse 22, when people in the New Testament times talk about David, they say, after removing Saul, he made David their king. God testifies concerning him, I have found David, son of Jesse, a man after my own heart. He will do everything I want him to do. Sounds really great. David sounds really great. He sounds like the complete package, an absolute hero. But David's heart wasn't good. It wasn't pure. It had corruption in it. David wasn't perfect or perfectly faithful. And this is proof to us because after this story, where God makes a covenant with David and David goes to the tabernacle to thank him, just 4 chapters later, we find the story of David and Bathsheba. Just 4 little chapters later, David takes another man's wife. He lies and deceives. And finally, to cover up what he's done, because the woman Bathsheba becomes pregnant, he has the woman's husband killed. A man who is innocent and completely blameless in all of this. David messed up so much. He continues to make so many horrendous mistakes. So, how can we, or more importantly, God, say this about David's heart? That he has a heart after God's own heart. We may be further surprised because Solomon, who was the son of David and Bathsheba, later said the following about his father. Solomon answered, he's speaking to God here, "You have shown great kindness to your servant, my father David, because he was faithful to you and righteous and upright in heart. You have continued this great kindness to him and have given him a son to sit on his throne this very day." Faithful and upright? Here Solomon is talking about his father, and as we hear this description he uses, we might end up asking, does Solomon know something we don't? Are we talking about the same David? It seems that Solomon does know something. He understands the nature of having a covenant relationship with God. Solomon gets how it works. The commandments are always covered by the mercy seat. God picks up the slack when those he's in a relationship with fail. He makes it so that there's a way back to him, always. Now, how can Solomon say these things of his father? Well, he's looking at David through God's eyes. Not because the wrong things he did weren't wrong, or that God is blind to the wrong things we do, but because God is so good and so kind. Now, there were serious consequences to David's actions. God didn't say, "Oh, yes, what you've done is okay." Definitely not. And there were serious consequences which followed. But God said, despite what you've done, we can be okay again in our relationship. I'm not going anywhere. I'm not leaving. Together we will honestly face what you've done, but I'm remaining faithful to my covenant with you. It always keeps coming back to this. Remember the Ark of the Covenant. The terms, the rules are covered by mercy. People in a covenant relationship are seen and treated so well because of how good God is, not because of how good they are. As it has been since the beginning of the covenant with Israel, now God's mercy is covering David. So, could it be that David's response to God, where God says, "I'm going to do all these things," and David responds, "Okay, thank you, I believe you." Could it be that this is what allows him to be described the way he was? That David is described as being a man after God's own heart, not because he's perfect. Here's something that was true about David. When he's called out for doing something wrong, he holds his hands up and says, "Yes, I have sinned. I have done something wrong." And he does this again and again and again, humbly and honestly. This is the heart response God is looking for in people. He is not demanding perfection because he knows that we can't achieve that presently. He is after a heart that tries to trust him and a heart that is willing to listen and move. This means to be humble and say, I made a mistake. Please help me to change. Please make something better from my shortcomings. The legacy of David is, thank you, I believe you. This is what a man after God's own heart looks like. So in this Davidic Covenant section, we can see that God recuts his covenant with David, and opens up about more details of how he's going to keep his covenant promises. It's going to be through the tribe of Judah, through the line of kings from David. Here are the texts. And for those who may want the parallel verses referencing God's repeated promises, they are on the screen now. If you'd like to take a screenshot of them, then you don't have to stress about hurrying to write them down. The Davidic covenant clearly renews the promises made in Eden, made to the patriarchs, and made to Israel at Sinai. All that Israel is now going to receive is going to be channeled through and out from the house of David. And so time alone will tell us how things will unfold moving forward. That is our class for today. This has been the Davidic Covenant. Next week, we are going to be exploring the prophets and the covenant. Thank you for joining us. See you next time.